Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 11, The Grand Junction Railway Part 2. In the last episode, we started to look at the Grand Junction Railway that linked Birmingham to Liverpool and Manchester, and was the first step in the national rail network that is still used in Britain today. Having taken the lessons learnt on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, we saw that a core group of businessmen who'd go on to be known as the Liverpool Party, and be instrumental in building railways all over the country, had recognised the benefits of railways that went beyond just connecting local markets. We traced the evolution of the line through the ups and downs of getting an act, and the somewhat ungainly squabbles of its engineers, before Joseph Locke emerged from the shadow of his former mentor. Today, we'll bring ourselves up to 1837 with a look at some of the civil engineering works on the line, including the magnificent Dutton Viaduct. We'll meet Thomas Brassey, the man who would go on to become the king of the 19th century railway contractors, and we'll see how the Grand Junction handled their opening. But before we get to all of that, we need to answer our last trivia question. And before I answer it, I need to correct it. Yes, that's right, as hard as it is to believe, in the last episode I made a mistake. On the last episode I asked, what was the first crew-type loco introduced by the Grand Junction in 1840? But the crew-type wasn't introduced in 1840 at all. In fact, the crew works weren't even built in 1840. I should have said, what was the first crew-type loco introduced by the Grand Junction in 1845? And the answer would have been Columbine, kind of. But not really, which was going to be my original point. See, before I cocked up the date, I'd chosen to ask that question so I could use the answer to tell an interesting story about telling historical stories. I thought it was quite clever. It would have gone a bit like this. I'm not a professional historian, I'm just a guy who finds history fascinating and figures you do too, or you wouldn't be here listening. But if I was a professional historian, you still shouldn't accept everything I'd say as 100% gospel. That's just not how knowledge works. To pull together the content for these episodes, I do lots of reading. Lots and lots of reading. Some of that's through dusty old books and archival material, including first-hand accounts from the companies themselves or newspapers and journals of the time. Some of it's more modern academic studies, and there are even some works by popular authors thrown in there. But none of it is infallible. So I was going to point out that Columbine is held in the National Collection. It's on display at the Science Museum in London. Next to it is a plaque that helpfully informs the reader that until the introduction of the crew-type loco, most locomotives had inside cylinders that drove cranked axles. The crew-type loco moved the cylinders outside and removed the complexity of the cranked axle. The plaque tells us that Columbine was built in 1845, was originally numbered number 49 for the Grand Junction, and was renumbered to 1868 in 1872 by the London and North Western. At some point it had a cab fitted to make life more pleasant for the driver and fireman, but that's been removed so visitors to the museum can get a sense of what the engine looked like when it was built. And, most importantly for this story, it says that Columbine was the first crew-type loco. But recent research apparently shows that Columbine wasn't the first crew-style engine built at all. In fact, it was more like the 20th. But the moral of the story isn't a gotcha moment for the Science Museum. The moral of the story is that lots of what we think we know is really just current understanding. I'd be very suspicious of anyone who claims to know beyond a doubt the correct interpretation of things that took place almost 200 years ago. You'll sometimes hear people say that the only way to be completely accurate is to go back to source material from the original date. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that solves the whole problem either. Modern news reporters are, usually, trying to tell us about things that are happening right now. Have you ever known them to make a mistake? Of course you have. Or, in a less politically charged situation, have you ever read the minutes of a meeting you've been in and thought, that's not what was said? Of course you have. Just going back to the sources from the time doesn't guarantee us 100% accuracy either. So, I asked the Columbine question to give me a chance to make an interesting point about humility and the limits of what it's possible for us to claim we really know. Then I cocked up the date, which either proves my point that people make mistakes or undermines me completely. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Anyway, with all of that said, I can promise you that the information I share with you on here is the best summary of sometimes conflicting accounts that I can make, using the best sources and the latest research I can find. So, if you're still interested in listening and learning together as we go, let's get on with the show and see what we can learn about the Grand Junction Railway. We'll start with the engineering. The Grand Junction gets a bit of a bad rap when it comes to the civil engineering works on the line. It's true that the land between Birmingham and Warrington doesn't really pose the greatest engineering challenges that railwaymen had to overcome in the 19th century. But that doesn't mean there's nothing of interest along the line, nor that it was easy to build. There are a couple of projects that are worthy of our attention, and one of them gives me the chance to introduce a character who deserves to be much better known. So first, tunnels. You might think, given that Joseph Locke had been responsible for the first of the great Edge Hill tunnels early in his career, and that his role in catching the errors on the latest one had triggered his difficulties with his old boss George Stephenson, that the GJR would have some grand examples of tunnels. But the geography of the area simply doesn't call for it. The longest tunnel on the GJR was at Wolverhampton, and it was only 200 yards long. If you've listened to episode 8 about the Liverpool and Manchester, you might remember that's less than a tenth the length of the Wapping tunnel that Locke had supervised around 8 years before. And the GJR had an even shorter tunnel at Preston Brook, which was only about 40 yards long. Preston Brook is just north of the Dutton Viaduct, that I'll talk about in a moment, and the tunnel there would barely warrant a mention at all, except that it was the scene of an entertaining spectacle shortly after the line opened, triggered by that most popular of British conversational topics, the weather. On the 20th of January 1838, just 7 months after the Grand Junction opened, the Globe newspaper reported, "The thermometer this morning at daybreak, outside a second-floor window in Coldbath Fields, was as low as 7, a degree of cold, we believe, unprecedented in England, at least in the memory of man." That's 7 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's about minus 14 degrees Celsius. And they were right to call it unprecedented. The winter of 1837 to 38 turned out to be the coldest in Britain through the whole of the 19th century. As a total aside, it's nice to be able to quote the Globe as well, because it has a little-known railway connection. It was started in 1803 by none other than Christopher Blackett, who I mentioned way back in episode 2. Blackett was the Wylam colliery owner who had tried to get Richard Trevithick to build him a locomotive in the early 1800s, and who then instructed William Headley and Timothy Hackworth to build the engine that became known as Puffing Billy. So the same man who was responsible for what is probably the world's oldest steam locomotive was also responsible for the Globe newspaper. But anyway, back to the GJR. I haven't just started talking about the weather because I'm British. That prolonged cold in early 1838 froze the ground around Preston Brook Tunnel to a depth that hadn't been considered when it was designed. In his 1839 book of the Grand Junction Railway, Thomas Roscoe tells us that when all of that frozen ground started to thaw, the clay soil through which the tunnel is formed suddenly expanded and forced in a considerable length of the building, which fell with a tremendous crash, effectually blocking up the passage of the line. For the next 10 days, while the railway cleared and rebuilt the tunnel, the line kept running, but on reaching Preston Brook, the passengers had to get out and scramble over the top of the hill to meet a train waiting on the other side. Roscoe again. This interruption to the monotony of the journey afforded them no slight degree of diversion and entertainment, and it may even be said that this was the merriest period since the opening of the line. Roscoe specialised in travel writing, both in Britain and abroad, and he was an unusually big fan of the new railways, so it's probably fair to say that his idea that it was the merriest period might not have been shared by the Victorians clambering over the hill in their finery. Still, if it wasn't for that amusing anecdote, none of the tunnels on the Grand Junction would really go down in the annals of railway engineering. The same isn't true of Dutton Viaduct. Dutton Viaduct owes much of its design to the earlier Sankey Viaduct on the L&MR. Like the viaduct at Sankey, it was designed to cross 2 bodies of water. In Dutton's case, the River Weaver and the Weaver Navigation, basically a canal that straightened out parts of the river and left the original smaller winding river in place. Also, like Sankey, it's still standing and in use, but one of the waterways beneath it has since dried up. The viaduct is about 1,300 feet long. It's made of 20 identical arches, each one spanning 65 feet, and it carries the line 65 feet above the surface of the water below. At the time, it was described as the greatest structure of its kind in the kingdom, and one of the most extraordinary and magnificent specimens of pontile architecture that this country can produce, or perhaps that has ever been erected since the days of the Romans. You can't help but admire the Victorians' penchant for hyperbole, but it is an impressive structure. Impressive enough to argue over, in fact. Locke received the credit in most of the accounts, but George Stephenson always claimed he designed it. Samuel Smiles' biography of Stephenson said it was perhaps the finest of George Stephenson's viaducts. To be fair, the design was complete while George Stephenson was still employed as principal engineer, and he does seem to have had some input, insisting that the piles should be deeper than Locke had originally intended. But Dutton is very much in the northern half of the line that was Joseph Locke's responsibility. The viaduct is Grade 2 star listed now, but Historic England sidestepped the debate about who really designed it by simply saying in their official record, "Completed 1836 by Joseph Locke and George Stephenson for the Grand Junction Railway Company." However, the minutes of the July 1834 board meeting include the recommendation that Mr. Locke's report on the formation of the Weaver Viaduct be accepted. So if we had to pick someone to credit, then my money's on Locke doing the real design work and Stephenson commenting on it and signing it off. Precisely in line with the arrangement the board tried to formalise a couple of months later, as we saw in the last episode. But whichever of the engineers was responsible for the design, the actual work was carried out under contract by David Mackintosh at a cost of £54,400. The work took 2 years, and amazingly for the time, none of the navvies involved in building it seemed to have been harmed. Or rather, in the words of the director who laid the ceremonial stone, no life and limb has been sacrificed, which I suppose isn't quite the same as saying that no one was injured at all. But compared to, say, Woodhead Tunnel, where the death rate amongst navvies was famously higher than the armies at the Battle of Waterloo, it was a near miracle. Now, while I'm talking about the Grand Junction's viaducts, I want to use another of them as an excuse to do 2 things. One, to show how the approach Joseph Locke brought to the GJR differed from his old mentors and made him a truly great engineer. And 2, to introduce a new character who, although he's often in the background, was incredibly important in the history of the railways. The viaduct that gives me the chance to do this neat little podcasting 2-for-1, if I do say so myself, isn't as grand as something like Dutton. In fact, it's a relatively small affair. Only about 360 feet long, Penkridge Viaduct is made of 7 arches, 30 feet wide and 37 feet high. It was built across the River Penk and a road that ran alongside it. In fact, in what I think is a first for the viaducts I've mentioned on this series, it actually still crosses them both. The river hasn't dried up, and you can still drive along the road. But obviously, that isn't really enough reason to talk about it. So, what does this little viaduct have to show us? Why am I talking about it at all? Well, you'll remember from episode 10 that before the GJR directors gave up on George Stephenson and made Joseph Locke the railway's principal engineer, they tried to keep both engineers happy by splitting responsibility for the line in half. Locke had responsibility for the northern half, and Stephenson, with the assistance of William Allcard, was responsible for the south. Well, the village of Penkridge is 5 miles south of Stafford, putting it squarely in Stephenson's domain. Throughout 1834, as the contracts were being let to build the line, it became apparent to the directors that the progress was very different in the north and the south. Apart from the wrangling with the Warrington and Newton Railway that I described in the last episode, which were the job of the board, not the engineer, the contracts on Locke's half of the line were all let by September 1834. But the same could not be said for Stephenson's half, where negotiations for the contracts were in a sorry state. Robert Hartley, writing in the November 2019 Journal of the Railway and Canal Historical Society, which, yes, is really a thing, of which I am a member, describes a set of plans he discovered that show George Stephenson was busily preparing revised plans for the line throughout 1833. He argues that as a result, Stephenson shouldn't be condemned for the delays in the contracts at his end of the line. Hartley's find is interesting, but in my view it doesn't really excuse Stephenson completely. We've seen already that Locke was simultaneously doing the very same thing in the north by surveying a new line to give the board an alternative to using the Warrington and Newton. And although that survey was much smaller than the stretch Stephenson was redoing, Locke was also supervising the physical work that had already started on his half of the line. But more importantly than my view is the view of the board at the time. As we saw in the last episode, there's no escaping the fact that they were clearly growing more and more frustrated with Stephenson's lack of attention to their line and his refusal to answer their questions. If that could be excused because he was fully occupied surveying their own line, surely they wouldn't have been anywhere near as frustrated, and Stephenson would have remained the GJR's principal engineer. As it was, and again as we saw last time, they were annoyed enough to progressively switch responsibility from Stephenson to Locke. And around the same time, as a result of the difference in the state of the contracts for the two halves of the line, the directors asked Locke to review the ones in the south. I mentioned on the last episode that Locke specified his contracts at a level of detail that was just unheard of up until that time. Norman Webster describes Locke's approach like this. His principles were simple. The work to be done on any contract must be exactly specified. Contractors had to convince the engineer that they fully understood their commitments, so that they should have no excuse for defaulting at a later stage. When Joseph Locke looked at the contracts his old mentor had supervised, he discovered at least part of the reason for the delay in getting them signed. The specifications that had been produced under Stephenson were just too vague for the contractors to be able to respond with anything like the level of certainty either party would want. George Stephenson undeniably had a visionary genius for both civil and mechanical engineering, but translating that vision into concrete instructions for others to follow was something he usually left to others. From as early as 1827, when his son Robert returned from South America, it was him who did the detailed work on locomotives, with George providing ideas and direction. And civils weren't really much different. As a rule, George identified capable assistants and laid out the approach he wanted taken, whether that was the design of a bridge or a viaduct, or the course of a line and the cuttings and embankments along it. It was his assistants who were expected to get into the detail. And there's nothing wrong with that approach at all, when the person you're leaving to do the detail works for you. But when they're an independent contractor, there are two problems. First, your interests don't necessarily align completely. You're kind of trusting them not to take advantage. And second, if you ask them to quote before they know the detail, they're going to give you a number that's covering a lot of uncertainty. The contract for Penkridge Viaduct is a perfect example of at least the second of those two problems. It shows the difference that Locke's detailed approach to specifications could make, and why he would develop a reputation for excellence throughout his life. When Locke got involved with the Southern contracts, the favoured contractor to build Penkridge Viaduct was the man whose entry onto the stage I've been teasing for a while, Thomas Brassey. Telling the story of the railways chronologically makes it hard to say how important Brassey would become, so I'm going to cheat a bit and jump out of our timeline here for a minute to give you a potted version of his life. Brassey was born in 1805 in a little village just south of Chester called Bourton. If you're listening to this outside of Britain and are afraid that never having heard of Bourton shows your woefully inadequate knowledge of British geography, don't feel too bad. Nobody in Britain has heard of it either. When Brassey was born, there were about 40 people living there, and in the 200 years since, the population has never got above 75. Hardly the best place to be born if you wanted to make your mark on the world. But that didn't stop Thomas Brassey. By the time he died in 1870, he was probably the most famous civil engineering contractor in the world. He'd built docks and sewer systems, and even helped finance the first reliable transatlantic telegraph cable in 1866. There'd been an earlier one in 1858, but it broke after a couple of months, and the public lost interest in financing another. But it was his work on the railways that really brought him to international renown and made his fortune. An often quoted statistic says that by the mid-1800s he was responsible for building more than a third of the railway lines in Britain, and at his death he'd built 3/4 of the miles in France, and 1/20 of every mile of railway track on the planet. As well as lines all over Britain, he built railways in Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, where he was responsible for most of the Grand Trunk Railway, including the locos and carriages, Denmark, France, Holland, India, Ireland, Italy, Mauritius, Norway, Prussia, Romania, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland and Ukraine, and I've almost certainly missed some. At the height of his contracts, there were more than 75,000 men working for him across the world. And astonishingly, he seems to have done it all without anyone thinking he was a dick, which frankly is probably the most impressive bit of all. Not bad for a lad from a village nobody has ever heard of. And the Grand Junction Railway was where it all began for him. Properly, at least, as we'll hear in a moment. Brassey had met George Stephenson in the late 1820s, when Stephenson was looking for stone for the Sankey Viaduct on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Brassey, then in his early 20s, managed a quarry that Stephenson visited. Stephenson was so impressed with the young man that he apparently suggested he come and work for him on the railways. Brassey didn't take him up on it, but he was convinced of the opportunity the new technology would provide. In 1834, when the Grand Junction Railway was letting its contracts, Brassey put in a bid to build the Dutton Viaduct I talked about earlier, but his price was too high, and, as we've seen, the contract was awarded to David Mackintosh. Brassey was undeterred and tried again, this time for the Penkridge Viaduct and the 10 miles of track around it. This was the position when Joseph Locke was asked to review the contracts on the southern part of the line. When Locke looked at the bid that Brassey had made to build Penkridge Viaduct, he thought it was ridiculously high, but he didn't blame the contractor. Instead, he put it down to the poor specification that his quote had been based on. Locke turned up unannounced at Brassey's home one morning, and while the contractor ate breakfast, apparently Locke had already eaten, they thrashed out the design at a level of detail that meant Brassey was able to slash his price. If we can believe the figures in Devy's biography of Locke, then Brassey's original quote was £26,000, and after Locke had worked with him on the specification, Brassey resubmitted his bid at only £6,000 and still made a fair profit. Those numbers seem a bit odd to me, but we do know for sure that in February 1835 the board awarded a contract to Brassey for £86,500 for the stretch of line that included Penkridge Viaduct and all of the embankments that approached it. Locke's belief that any contract must be exactly specified had unblocked the problem. Sir Arthur Helps, who wrote the earliest biography of Brassey in 1872, described the Grand Junction Railway as Brassey's first railway contract. We now know that isn't quite right. He had actually built an industrial railway in 1830 for the Marston Salt Works. The Salt Works Railway was 1.3 miles of single track, wrought iron edge rails. While it wasn't long, the trucks were horse-drawn and history largely forgot about it, it must have given young Brassey valuable experience and presumably a taste for railways. But his work on the Grand Junction Railway with Joseph Locke was where his railway career really got started. And it was the beginning of a partnership between the two men that would take them all over the world. Although Brassey would go on to work with many engineers, 5 of his first 6 contracts and his first international one were with Locke. If it wasn't for the Grand Junction Railway, who knows whether the world's greatest railway contractor would ever have had the global impact he did. So before we leave the civil engineering altogether, there are 2 more things I want to cover, and they're both about the Birmingham end of the line. The first is easily dealt with, the Terminus. For most of its life, the Grand Junction, and until it moved completely to New Street Station, the London and North Western, terminated in a station at Curzon Street, alongside the even grander London and Birmingham Terminus building that still stands, and is currently planned to form part of HS2. But as they approached their self-imposed deadline in 1837, the last part of the line wasn't finished, so the GJR directors decided to open a temporary station called Vauxhall, about 3/4 of a mile north of Curzon Street. The second point is the course of that line near Birmingham. Vauxhall is to the northeast of Birmingham, and an odd place to find a railway that had to run to the west of Birmingham for almost its whole length. So why was it anywhere near Vauxhall at all? The original intention of the directors of the Grand Junction was for their line to meet end to end with the London and Birmingham line. As a result, passengers and goods would have been able to travel seamlessly from Liverpool or Manchester to the capital. For this, the plan that John Urpeth Rastrick made shows the GJR approaching from a slight northwest direction, as you'd expect. But if you look at a plan of the line, you'll see that didn't happen. The revised plan that George Stephenson was producing in 1833, which Hartley discovered and I mentioned earlier, shifted the entry to Birmingham so that it was almost directly from the north. In 1834, it was shifted even further, so that by the time it was built, it has an ungainly dogleg in it, overshooting Birmingham slightly before approaching from the northeast. And the reason for these repeated changes was the same in each case. James Watt Jr., to be precise. Watt ran the famous Soho foundry that his father and Matthew Bolton Sr. had set up, along with Bolton's son, also called Matthew Bolton. As an industrialist, not least one whose father was so instrumental to the steam engine, you might have expected him to be sympathetic to the railways. But if he was, then that sympathy didn't extend as far as welcoming them over his estate. Watt lived in a grand stately home called Aston Hall, which sat squarely in the path of the original line. The first plan called for a tunnel under his land, but he wasn't a fan of that idea. The revised 1833 plan reduced the impact, but he still wasn't having it. The GJR chairman, John Moss, announced, "The directors found it expedient to insert a clause engaging them not to make the line through Aston Park without Mr. Watt's consent. Since the passing of the Act, his consent has been formally applied for, and refused." Hence the final revision, which can't really have pleased anyone. Watt ended up with a railway line 600 metres from the front of his house, which apparently cut off the end of the avenue of chestnut trees leading to his front door, Poor man, I'd hate it if that happened to my stately home. And although Moss tried to spin it in a positive way for the railway, describing the line as preferable in all other respects to the original, it meant the line was a mile longer, and for the last part actually ran parallel to the London and Birmingham line. So much for an end-to-end connection. However, it did at least mean they got approval, and by June 1835, the route that the GJR would follow was set. So what about the track that would run along that route? Despite the difficulties between Stephenson and Locke, there was no question which gauge the GJR would use. Locke was a lifelong committed supporter of Stephenson's 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge, which by now had gained its extra half an inch. Like the L&MR, the GJR had a double track, but in one important respect the lines differed. The gap between the up and down lines, which had been set to 4-foot 8 on the L&MR, and which so clearly contributed to the death of Huskisson on the opening day, was extended to 6 foot on the GJR. In his early days, Locke also followed the example Stephenson had set in the formation of the track on the Liverpool and Manchester. Drainage ditches were dug to ensure the ground stayed as dry as possible, and the surface was covered in a layer of sand, gravel or ash at least a foot deep. The rails were then supported by a mix of stone blocks and transverse wooden sleepers. Locke was less married to supporting the rails on stone blocks than Robert Stephenson would be on the London and Birmingham, but any objections he had to them seemed to be on a cost basis, rather than an appreciation of the benefits that wooden sleepers would soon be seen to bring. He still believed, as everybody appeared to at this time, that it was essential for a railway to have a solid foundation. The benefits of flexible strength in the rails had not yet been understood. He also followed the standard practice of the day and buried the sleepers in both cases with ballast, so that only the rails were showing. The rails themselves, though, were another matter. In the last episode, I described how George Stephenson ignored the GJR's directors' request to produce a report on the type of rails they should use for their line. As we saw, in the end Locke wrote that report for them himself, and they approved it in June 1835. But I promised then to come back and touch on the rails themselves. So what was so special about them? Well, until this point, most tracks had used fish-bellied rails. In case you've not heard earlier episodes, you can picture a length of fish-belly rail by imagining looking at it from the side. Draw a straight line in your head for the top of the rail and a curved line for the bottom. The curve in theory looks like the belly of a fish, hence the name. Though, frankly, that's a bit of a stretch. It just looks like a curve to me, hence the proper name, elliptical rail. Anyway, having reminded yourself of that, you can forget it now, because from this point onwards, the engineers of the day were realising disadvantages of fish-bellied rails and starting to move away from them, albeit slowly. Experiments with different types of rails were going on along the length of the Liverpool and Manchester, and the directors of the London and Birmingham had actually asked Professor Peter Barlow, a mathematician from Woolwich Military Academy, to carry out a formal assessment on the properties of wrought iron rails. But everything couldn't be put on hold waiting for that report, so at the same time on the GJR, Joseph Locke was doing his own tests for the report for his board. He used a hydraulic press to bend lengths of different types of rail and recorded the weight that needed to bend them permanently out of shape. The parallel rail that Locke recommended, which would become known as double-headed rail, took 3 times as much pressure to bend as the elliptical rail that had been used on the Liverpool and Manchester, and which Robert Stephenson was still recommending on the London and Birmingham. Admittedly, the test probably wasn't quite as scientific as it could have been. Barlow challenged the accuracy of the press Locke used, and the winning rail was twice as heavy as the L&MR fish-bellied one, but the point had been made. So, as I said, in June 1835, the board approved Locke's report, and then, just under a year later, on the 9th of March 1836, when the work on the line was sufficiently advanced, they authorised him to order the rails and chairs he'd recommended. As its name suggests, the double-headed rail was the same on the top and the bottom. The idea was that as the rail became worn, it could be turned over, doubling its useful life. In practice, this rarely happened, as the wear and tear wasn't even. Nonetheless, the double-headed rail became the standard across Britain until the 20th century, when it was replaced by flat-bottomed Vignoles rails, named after Charles Vignoles, the engineer Locke took over from on the Liverpool and Manchester after George Stephenson kicked him out. Side note for American listeners, you call this same type of flat-bottomed rail the Stevens rail, after Robert Stevens, who used it on the Camden and Amboy Railroad in 1831. We don't know for sure if Vignoles and Stevens ever met, but it's perfectly possible. In 1830, there was nobody in America who could produce Stevens rail, so he came to Britain to get them made. While he was here, he visited the recently opened L&MR, and we know that Vignoles was in Liverpool at the same time. But whether you call it Vignoles rail or Stevens rail, the GJR didn't use it. They used the double-headed rail that Locke recommended. Presumably because he was the one who recommended to the Grand Junction Board, Locke has sometimes been credited with inventing the double-headed rail. But it doesn't look like that was the case. He never claimed to have come up with it, just that it was the best solution available. Andrew Dow believes that it was actually invented by, wait for it, Charles Vignoles. So it's fair to say that one way or another, anybody who has travelled by train in Britain in the last 150 years took their journey on metals that owed something to Charles Vignoles. And one of the first group to do so were the inaugural Grand Junction passengers on the 4th of July 1837. For those of you who've heard me describe the opening day of the Liverpool and Manchester, or even the Stockton and Darlington railways, the opening of the Grand Junction will seem a little odd. The company put on no celebrations at all. In the words of a reporter for the Times, it presented a striking contrast to the station yard on Olive Mount at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. It was evident, indeed, that no exertions had been made to give éclat to the proceedings of the day. There were no bands of music, no profuse display of banners, no attendance of distinguished visitors. In fact, within the precincts of the station there was scarcely anything to distinguish it from an ordinary day of business. The only display we observed was a small flag attached to the first carriage of the train, on which was emblazoned in small characters with the royal arms the letters WR and AR. Those letters stood for William Rex and Adelaide Regina, and represented the King and the Queen, or, more accurately, the previous King and Queen. William IV had died on the 20th of June, which of course is only a fortnight earlier, and in Britain's first trunk line, Webster suggests that since formal mourning periods were still a very real thing in 19th century Britain, that explains the GJR's muted opening. He's right about the mourning period, but I don't find it very convincing for exactly that reason. By a weird coincidence, William himself had come to the throne just under 3 months before the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester, and since the full mourning period for a sovereign was 12 weeks, they'd still have been in mourning then as well. And as we've seen, it didn't stop this very same group of men organising a fair old party. Nor did it stop the Prime Minister of the time attending it. So mourning for the King probably doesn't explain why they didn't make a fuss 7 years later. Arthur Freeling suggested in his 1837 account that it was because John Moss and Charles Lawrence, the deputy chairman, were both present at the death of Huskisson on the L&MR, and it was unattended by any display out of respect to the memory of the late Mr. Huskisson, who met with the fatal accident which caused his death at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester line. Freeling claimed he had written his account with Moss and Locke's help, so it's a bit weird that he didn't mention that Locke had been on the footplate of Rocket the day it knocked Huskisson down and killed him. Well, I think the answer's more prosaic than either Webster or Freeling suggest. None of the men involved in the GJR by the time it opened were showmen. They were businessmen. They were building a service for people to buy, and while railways were still relatively new, they just didn't need to put on the sort of fanfare that the L&MR did when it opened. And if you didn't need to do it, then why would you? And if that is what they were thinking, then they were proved right. Despite the fact that they ran the day as a normal operating day, thousands of spectators turned up to watch. Harris's Birmingham Gazette said that the town of Birmingham was in a state of great commotion and excitement, owing to the public opening of the railway. Soon after 5 o'clock, streets leading in the direction of Vauxhall were crowded with persons of all ranks, anxious to be witnesses of the first public travelling on the most important line of railway. That's 5 o'clock in the morning, by the way. And according to the Times, the bridge across the line at Vauxhall, the embankments, much of the route between Birmingham and Wolverhampton, were literally covered with dense masses of admiring spectators. At 7 a.m, precisely on time, locomotive number 8, named Wildfire, a 222 built by Robert Stephenson and Company, pulling a train of 8 carriages, steamed out of the station. Unlike at Liverpool, there were no restrictions on using steam power in the city of Birmingham. To quote Harris's Birmingham Gazette again, the train started slowly, but, upon emerging from the yard, speedily burst off at a rapid pace. To those who for the first time witnessed such a scene, it was peculiarly exciting, and the immense multitude, as far as the eye could reach, gave expression to their admiration by loud and long-continued cheering and the waving of hats and handkerchiefs. The first trains from the north had left both Liverpool and Manchester at 6:30 a.m. They arrived at Birmingham at 11:27, 22 minutes late, having been delayed by crowds at the stations along the route. It was only one of several trains from the north that were delayed. but otherwise the day went off almost without a hitch. The biggest concern came at 10 p.m, when the first mixed train was scheduled to return and failed to turn up. It still hadn't arrived by 10 to midnight, at which point the final first-class train of the day was also missing. Finally, at 3 o'clock in the morning, both missing trains limped into Vauxhall station. Apparently, one of the boiler tubes in the mixed train had broken and needed fixing on site. Still, given that nobody got shot in the face by a cannon, no MPs were killed, and the Prime Minister wasn't chased from a city, I think we can call it a more successful opening than the opening of the L&MR. There's a lot more that could be said about the Grand Junction Railway. It was the site of the first travelling post office, and the reason that the town of Crewe exists, mostly. But we'll leave them here at their successful, if understated, opening. I wanted to highlight the GJR, not just because the line that Joseph Locke built is still in use today as a key part of the West Coast Main Line, but because I think it's been seriously underestimated in most railway histories. Norman Webster argued that it's been downplayed because George Stephenson had sour grapes about losing his job, but I think that's unfair. Not entirely inaccurate, perhaps, but unfair. I think it's been downplayed mainly because it was conceived as a business venture by faceless financiers and bureaucrats, and then built without any dramatic deviation from the plan by a reliable engineer who was more interested in delivery than self-aggrandisement. In short, I think it's been downplayed because if you don't look at it in the right way, it is more boring than the L&MR and the S&DR, or even the London and Birmingham with its troubles at Kilsby. But it's precisely because it's more boring that, in my opinion, makes it a mark of the maturing of the railways. There's still a way to go, of course. There are plenty of exciting stories of near disaster left to tell, but the GJR demonstrated that it was possible to think of a railway, build it, and run it as a profitable business without much drama. For my mind, it even marks a watershed in the character of the engineers. It may sound like I've been harsh towards George Stephenson over some of these podcasts, but the man was obviously incredibly impressive and essential for the founding of the railway age. I just think he's been slightly badly categorised. I've never read this anywhere or heard anyone else make the point, so I warn you now you're getting my own unfiltered thoughts, but I don't think we should think of Stephenson as an engineer at all. I think he's an inventor who forced himself into an engineer box. Like Richard Trevithick, but more effective. His son Robert and his one-time apprentice Joseph Locke, on the other hand, were real engineers. And with their rise, the railway age became more repeatable, more professional. And with them came the boring businessman. And then, of course, the flashy businessman looking to make a quick buck and nearly breaking the country's economy at the time, but that's another story. The men behind the GJR weren't genius inventors, engineers, or even pioneers, really. But without them, we may not have had a national railway network, and they did represent the march of progress. To me, their achievement is summed up by a simple comparison. When the men who first thought of the line that became the Grand Junction Railway wanted to discuss the idea, it took them 13 hours to travel between Birmingham and Liverpool. From the 4th of July 1837 onwards, it took 4.5. So, I hope you've enjoyed learning about the Grand Junction Railway. If you have, then please leave a review or drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com, and I hope you'll come and join me on the next episode of the History of the Railways. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.